He saw the empire fall piece by piece, then he chose his own ending. Taira no Tomomori was the clearest-eyed commander in the Heike clan, the one who understood, better than anyone, exactly where things were heading. He was right about everything. It did not save anyone. At Dan-no-ura, when the battle was lost and his family was dying around him, Tomomori did not wait to be captured. He secured 2 anchors under his arms and stepped off his ship into the sea. He had made sure there was no way back. He was a son of Taira no Kiyomori, born into the same world of extraordinary power and refinement that produced Kenreimon-in and Shigehira and all of Kiyomori's other children. The exact place he occupied among Kiyomori's sons is recorded with some variation across different sources, but he was among the younger generation of brothers, born in the years when the Taira ascendancy was already well established. He grew up, like his siblings, in Kyoto, in the world of silk and ceremony and the accumulated refinement of the Heian court that Kiyomori's political success had made available to his children. But what distinguished Tomomori, even from a young age, was a quality of temperament that set him apart from the more visible figures of the next Taira generation. Munemori, who would eventually become the head of the clan after Kiyomori's death, was a man whose position came primarily from his birth order, the eldest surviving son, and whose qualities by most accounts were not those of a particularly decisive leader. Shigehira, as we have seen, was known for his temper and his presence, qualities that led him toward command and toward Nara. Tomomori was known for something different. He was known for being clear-headed. The records that describe him use language that suggests a man who assessed situations accurately, who did not let wishful thinking distort his understanding of what was actually happening, and who was willing to say what he saw, even when what he saw was not what the people around him wanted to hear. This quality made him valuable. It also made him, in certain respects, isolated. A family in the process of building and maintaining enormous power does not always want clear-eyed assessment. It wants confirmation, the reassurance that the trajectory is correct, that the foundations are solid, that the things being risked for good reason and will pay off. Tomomori could provide military competence. He could provide strategic thinking. What he could not always provide, or what was not always welcomed when he provided it, was the kind of unwavering optimism that powerful families often prefer from the people around them. In the years before the Genpei War, Tomomori held positions appropriate to his rank, the kind of court titles and military responsibilities that Taira sons accumulated as the family's power expanded. He was not, in these years, a figure of particular prominence. The Taira were at their height. Kiyomori's decisions shaped everything. The sons, including Tomomori, occupied positions within the structure their father had built, contributing to its function without yet being called upon to demonstrate what they could do when the structure itself came under threat. That call would come soon enough. When the war began in 1180, Tomomori was already an adult, already a man with military experience and a developed sense of how the world worked. He was not, like Shigehira would be at Nara, a young man suddenly thrust into a defining moment without preparation. Tomomori entered the war as a man who already understood, perhaps better than most of his brothers, what kind of conflict this was likely to become. He had watched the Minamoto in the east for years. He had seen the patterns of provincial unrest, the slow accumulation of resentment against Taira dominance that had been building since long before Yoritomo raised his standard. What he thought about all of this, in the early days of the war, before anyone could know how it would end, is something the records do not directly preserve. But the man who would emerge, over the following 5 years, as one of the Taira commanders most associated with clear strategic thinking, with honest assessment of difficult situations, and ultimately with one of the most memorable deaths in the entire conflict, was already, in 1180, present in the world, watching, assessing, and waiting to see what would be asked of him. The early years of the Genpei War established roles for the Taira commanders that would, in large part, persist through the rest of the conflict. Munemori, as the eldest surviving son and the new head of the clan after Kiyomori's death in 1181, held overall command, at least in name. Shigehira, as we know, became associated with Nara and carried that association into every subsequent campaign. Yorimori, another brother, held various commands, and Tomonori, over these years, became known as the commander whose assessments could be trusted, the man whose read of a military situation was, more often than not, the accurate one, even when the accuracy was unwelcome. This reputation was built through a series of engagements where Tomonori's judgment proved correct in ways that, in retrospect, the Taira leadership might have benefited from listening to more carefully at the time. The pattern that emerges from the surviving accounts is one of Tomonori consistently identifying the actual strength and capability of Minamoto forces, while other Taira commanders, operating from the assumption of Taira superiority that had been the family's experience for a generation, underestimated what they were facing. This was not Tomonori being pessimistic for its own sake. It was Tomonori looking at the actual evidence, the actual movements and capabilities of the forces opposing the Taira, and drawing conclusions based on that evidence rather than on the assumptions that had governed Taira strategic thinking for years. The defeat at Kurikara Toge in 1183, Yoshinaka's destruction of the largest Taira army ever assembled through the famous tactic of driving burning cattle into the Taira lines at night, was the kind of event that, in retrospect, validated the kind of caution that Tomonori had been advocating. Whether Tomonori specifically warned against the engagement, or against the assumptions that led to the Taira commitment of such a large force to a single battle in unfamiliar mountain terrain, is not something the records establish with certainty, but the pattern of his subsequent reputation, the way later accounts treat him as the commander whose foresight was repeatedly vindicated by events, suggests that Kurikara Toge was part of a larger pattern that Tomonori had been observing and, to whatever extent he could, trying to communicate. The retreat from Kyoto in the summer of 1183 was the moment when Tomonori's clear-sightedness became, in a sense, vindicated on the largest possible scale. The Taira were leaving the capital they had controlled for a generation. They were taking the emperor and the sacred regalia into a retreat whose ultimate outcome no one could predict, but whose immediate reality, the loss of Kyoto, the loss of the institutional center of Taira power, was undeniable. For a man like Tomonori, who had spent years assessing the actual military situation rather than the comfortable assumptions, this moment was not, presumably, a surprise in the way it was for commanders who had believed, until the very end, that Taira power was secure. This does not mean Tomonori welcomed it, or that clear-sightedness made the loss easier to bear. It means that Tomonori, perhaps more than most of his brothers, understood what was happening, and what it likely meant for everything that would follow. In the western provinces, as the Taira established their new positions, Tomonori's role became increasingly important. The Taira needed someone who could assess, accurately, what their actual remaining capabilities were, what positions could realistically be held, what engagements could realistically be won, and what the overall trajectory of the war looked like given the resources that remained. Tomomori provided this assessment. It was not always an encouraging assessment. The Taira, by 1184, were a clan fighting from a position of genuine weakness, despite still commanding significant forces, and despite still holding the symbolic authority of the emperor and the regalia. Tomomori understood this. The question, for him, was not whether the Taira could somehow return to the position of dominance they had held before 1180. That possibility, by 1184, was essentially gone. The question was, what could be salvaged, what positions could be held, and eventually, what kind of ending was available to a clan that was, by every realistic measure, losing a war it had once assumed it could not lose. Ichinotani, in the first month of 1184, was a disaster for the Taira in ways that went beyond the immediate military defeat. Shigehira was captured. Many Taira warriors died on the beach, including Atsumori, whose death at the hands of Kumagai Naozane would become one of the most remembered moments of the entire war. Tomomori survived Ichinotani. He was among the Taira who escaped to the ships, who continued the retreat westward toward Yashima, toward the next position, toward whatever came after. By this point, Tomomori's clear-sightedness was not a luxury or a personality trait that the Taira leadership could take or leave. It was becoming, increasingly, the only realistic framework through which the clan's remaining options could be understood. The man who had always seen things as they were was now the man whose vision of things as they were included the recognition that the things being seen were coming to an end. The retreat from Kyoto in 1183 is a moment that has appeared in this channel before, from the perspective of kenreimon-in, whose departure from the only city she had ever known marked the beginning of the end of the world she had been born into. From Tomomori's perspective, the same event carried a different kind of weight. He was not, like kenreimon-in, leaving behind a life organized around poetry and ceremony and the particular textures of court existence. He was leaving behind a strategic position, the capital, the institutional center, the symbolic heart of the authority the Taira claimed to represent, and he understood, with the clarity that defined him, exactly what that loss meant for everything that came after. A war fought from outside the capital is a fundamentally different war from a war fought to defend it. When the Taira controlled Kyoto, when they held the emperor and the regalia within the traditional seat of imperial authority, their cause had a specific kind of legitimacy, the legitimacy of the established order defending itself against rebellion. Once they left, once they became an army in the field, moving from position to position, carrying the emperor and the regalia with them, rather than housing them in the palace where they belonged, the nature of their cause changed. They were no longer simply the defenders of the existing order. They were increasingly one faction among several, fighting to recover something that had been lost, and the longer the recovery did not happen, the more the original legitimacy of their position eroded. Tomomori understood this erosion. It was not simply a matter of military positions and troop numbers, though those mattered too. It was a matter of how the war was perceived, by the court families who remained in Kyoto under the new Minamoto-aligned order, by the provincial families whose support the Taira needed, and whose calculations about which side to back were influenced by which side seemed likely to prevail, and by the Taira's own warriors, whose morale and commitment were affected by the difference between fighting to hold what you have and fighting to recover what you have lost. This is the kind of consideration that does not show up directly in the accounts of specific battles, but that shapes, in fundamental ways, how those battles are fought and what their outcomes mean. The western provinces, where the Taira established their new base, were familiar territory, in the sense that the family's original power base had been here before Kiyomori's political rise had moved the center of Taira activity toward Kyoto. There was, in this return to the west, a kind of circularity that Tomomori, with his characteristic clarity, may well have recognized. The Taira had risen from these provinces. They were now retreating to them. The question that Tomomori's clear-sightedness was particularly suited to addressing was whether this retreat represented a temporary setback from which recovery was possible, or whether it represented something more final, the closing of a circle that had opened a generation before. The accounts of Tomomori during this period describe a man who continued to function, who continued to hold commands and make assessments and contribute to the Taira military effort, without illusions about what the overall situation actually was. This combination, continued functional contribution, alongside clear awareness of the difficulty of the overall situation, is psychologically demanding in a way that is easy to underestimate. It would have been simpler, in some ways, to either believe the optimistic framing that other Taira leaders may have preferred, the framing in which recovery was likely and the current difficulties were temporary, or to give up entirely, to stop contributing because the cause seemed lost. Tomomori did neither. He continued to do his job, with full awareness of how difficult the job had become, and with full awareness of what the most likely outcomes were. This is perhaps one of the most quietly remarkable things about Tomomori as a figure in the Heike Monogatari. The chronicle is full of dramatic moments, sudden reversals, individual acts of extraordinary courage or extraordinary tragedy. Tomomori's role in the years between Kyoto and Dan-no-ura was less dramatic, but no less significant. He was the commander who kept assessing, kept contributing, kept doing the work of trying to hold together a military effort that he understood, better than most, was unlikely to succeed in its larger objectives. What this kind of clear-eyed persistence costs a person over years is not the kind of thing the chronicle records directly. But it is there, in the pattern of Tomomori's role through these years, the steady presence of a man who saw what was coming and continued to do what could be done anyway. Yashima, after Ichinotani, became the new center of Taira resistance. The island position in the inland sea offered advantages that Ichinotani had not, primarily the security that came from being surrounded by water that the Taira fleet controlled, water that represented the one area where Taira strength remained genuinely superior to anything the Minamoto could muster. The emperor was brought here, the regalia was brought here, kenreimon-in was here, along with the surviving members of the Taira court, the remnant of the civilization that had once governed Japan from Kyoto, now reduced to a fortified position on an island, defended primarily by ships. Tomomori's role at Yashima involved the kind of work that his clear-sightedness made him suited for, the assessment of the position's actual defensibility, the identification of vulnerabilities, the planning for contingencies that the more optimistic members of the Taira leadership might prefer not to consider. The position had a specific vulnerability, one that Tomomori, among others, would have understood. Yashima's defenses were oriented toward the sea. toward the direction from which the Taira fleet's dominance made an attack difficult. The land approaches to the position from the main island were less heavily defended, on the assumption that an attacking force would need to cross water to reach Yashima, regardless of which direction it came from, and that the Taira fleet would intercept any such crossing before it became a threat. This assumption was reasonable, given normal circumstances. Yoshitsune was not going to provide normal circumstances. The accounts of the period before Yoshitsune's attack on Yashima describe a Taira leadership that was, to varying degrees, confident in the security of the position. The fleet was strong, the island was defensible. The previous defeats, Ichinotani above all, had been land battles, fought on terrain where the Minamoto's tactical advantages, the speed and unconventional approaches that had characterized Yoshitsune's victories, could be brought to bear. Yashima, surrounded by water that the Taira controlled, seemed to remove this advantage. Tomonori's assessment, to the extent it is reflected in the broader pattern of his role during this period, appears to have been less confident than this general mood. The pattern of Yoshitsune's victories throughout the war had been victories achieved through approaches the Taira had not anticipated, through speed and unconventional choices that turned apparent disadvantages into advantages. There was no specific reason to believe Yashima would be different, except the hope that this position, finally, was different. What Tomonori specifically said or recommended in the period before Yoshitsune's attack is not preserved in detail in the surviving accounts. What the accounts do preserve in the larger arc of the story is what happened, and what happened was, once again, Yoshitsune doing something the Taira had not adequately prepared for. In the second month of 1185, Yoshitsune crossed to Yashima with a much smaller force than conventional military thinking would have considered sufficient for an attack on a fortified island position defended by a superior fleet. He crossed in difficult weather, conditions that the Taira had assumed would prevent any crossing, conditions that most commanders would have considered too dangerous to risk. Yoshitsune risked it. The attack on Yashima, when it came from the land side, from the direction the Taira defenses were weaker, exactly the kind of approach that Tomonori's clear-sighted assessment, if it had been fully heeded, might have anticipated and prepared for. The Taira were caught, again, by an attack that arrived from a direction, and in a manner that conventional expectations had not prepared them for. The fighting at Yashima was not as catastrophic, in terms of immediate casualties, as Ichinotani had been, but the strategic effect was severe. The Taira position, which had been understood as secure, as a place from which the clan could regroup, and from which perhaps some kind of recovery might eventually be planned, was no longer secure. The Taira had to retreat again. Tomonori, in the aftermath of Yashima, found himself in a position that his clear-sightedness had, in a sense, been preparing him for throughout the war, but that no amount of clear-sightedness could make easier. The Taira had now lost Kyoto, lost the battle at Ichinotani with the capture of Shigehira, and lost the position at Yashima that had been intended as a secure base for recovery. The remaining Taira forces, the remaining ships, the Emperor, the regalia, kenreimon-in, all of it was now moving toward whatever came next, toward the western edge of the inland sea, toward the strait where the inland waters meet the open channel. Tomonori had seen the pattern of the war clearly enough to understand what this continued series of defeats meant. The question that remained was not whether the Taira could still win, The question was what kind of ending was approaching, and what role Tomonori himself would play in it. In the aftermath of Yashima, as the Taira fleet moved westward toward the strait of Dan-no-ura, the question of what had gone wrong, and whether it could have gone differently, would have been present in the minds of the Taira leadership, even if it was not always discussed openly. Tomonori's position in this moment was a complicated one. If his earlier assessments, his earlier warnings about the patterns of Yoshitsune's attacks, about the vulnerability of positions that seemed secure but had not adequately accounted for unconventional approaches, had been more fully heeded, would Yashima have gone differently? This is the kind of question that has no clean answer, and that Tomonori, with his characteristic clarity, would likely have recognized as having no clean answer. The relationship between Tomonori and his brother Munemori, the head of the clan, is one of the dynamics that the Heike Monogatari handles with a degree of subtlety. Munemori was not, by most accounts, a commander of particular military gifts. His position came from birth order, from being the eldest surviving son after Kiyomori's death, not from any demonstrated capability that distinguished him as a strategic or tactical leader. Tomonori, by contrast, had exactly this kind of capability, the clear-sightedness, the accurate assessment of situations, that a clan in Munemori's position desperately needed. The dynamic between a nominal leader who lacks the qualities the situation requires and a capable subordinate whose qualities are needed but whose position does not give him final authority is one that produces specific kinds of tension that does not always express itself as open conflict, but that shapes how decisions get made and how responsibility gets distributed when things go wrong. The accounts do not depict open conflict between Tomonori and Munemori. The Taira, even in their decline, maintained the forms of hierarchy and deference that governed relationships between brothers of different rank within a clan. But the underlying dynamic, the gap between who had the clearest understanding of the situation and who had the authority to act on that understanding, is part of what makes Tomonori's story resonant. He saw clearly, he may not always have been heeded, and as the war moved toward its conclusion, the gap between seeing clearly and being able to change the outcome based on what was seen became, in its own way, one of the central facts of his situation. There is a specific kind of burden that comes with being right, when being right does not change the outcome. Tomonori had been right about Kurikara Toge, in the sense that the pattern of Taira overconfidence that led to that disaster was a pattern Tomonori's clear-sightedness would have recognized as dangerous. He had been right, in the broader sense, about the trajectory of the war after Kyoto was lost, about the erosion of Taira legitimacy and capability that the retreat represented. He may have been right, in ways the records do not fully detail, about Yashima, about the vulnerability that Yoshitsune's attack exploited. Each time, being right did not prevent the outcome. The outcomes happened anyway, because being right about a situation and having the authority or the influence to change how that situation unfolds are not the same thing. As the fleet moved toward Dan-no-ura, Tomonori would have been doing what he had done throughout the war, assessing the situation as it actually was. The Taira fleet remained large, the Taira warriors remained capable, the inland sea remained, in some sense, Taira water, the territory where the clan's naval strength had always been greatest. But the pattern of the war, the pattern that Tomonori had been observing for years, was a pattern of Taira strengths being matched, again and again, by Minamoto approaches that the Taira had not anticipated. Dan-no-ura was going to be the next test of this pattern. The strait's currents were complex, shifting with the tides in ways that favored a fleet that knew the local waters, which the Taira did, and the Minamoto, coming from the east, generally did not. This was an advantage, but Tomomori, of all people, would have understood that advantages, in this war, had not been sufficient to prevent defeat when the opposing side found approaches that the advantages did not account for. What Tomomori expected as the Taira prepared for what would become the final battle of the Genpei War is not directly recorded in terms of specific predictions, but the broader pattern of his role, the clear-sighted assessment that had characterized his contribution to the Taira war effort from the beginning, suggests a man who understood that Dan-no-ura represented not just another battle, but likely the final test of whether the Taira, as a military and political force, would continue to exist. He had seen Ichinotani, he had seen Yashima, he understood what those defeats meant for the trajectory of the war. Dan-no-ura was coming. Tomomori, more clearly than perhaps anyone else in the Taira leadership, understood what was actually at stake. The journey from Yashima to Dan-no-ura was the final movement of the Taira fleet, the last repositioning before the engagement that would end the war. The Strait of Dan-no-ura lies at the western end of the inland sea, where the calmer inland waters meet the more turbulent waters of the channel, separating the main island of Japan from the southern island of Kyushu. The currents here are genuinely complex, shifting direction with the tides in ways that can transform the same stretch of water from a help to a hindrance, depending on timing. This complexity was, in the calculations of the Taira leadership, an advantage. The local knowledge of these currents, accumulated over generations of Taira presence in these waters, was something the Minamoto, coming from elsewhere, would not have. Tomomori, during the preparations for Dan-no-ura, would have been engaged in the kind of assessment that had characterized his role throughout the war, looking at the actual disposition of forces, the actual capabilities on both sides, and forming a judgment about what was likely to happen. The Taira fleet, despite the losses and retreats of the previous years, remained substantial. Estimates from the chronicles suggest several hundred ships carrying warriors who, whatever the broader trajectory of the war, remained committed to the Taira cause and capable of fighting. The Minamoto fleet, under Yoshitsune's command, was smaller in numbers of ships, though it carried warriors who had, by this point in the war, an established record of finding ways to overcome numerical and positional disadvantages. The presence of the Emperor and the regalia on the Taira ships added a dimension to Dan-no-ura that distinguished it from the previous battles of the war. Ichinotani and Yashima had been military engagements with significant strategic consequences, but the Emperor's presence at Dan-no-ura meant that this battle carried a symbolic weight beyond the purely military. Whatever happened to the Taira fleet would also determine what happened to the Emperor, to the regalia, to kenreimon-in, and the other women of the court who remained with the fleet. Tomomori, in his clear-sighted way, would have understood that Dan-no-ura was not simply a battle whose outcome would determine territorial control or military advantage. It was a battle whose outcome would determine whether the imperial line, in the specific person of the child Emperor Tokuhito, and the sacred objects that legitimized that line, would remain in Taira hands, or pass to whatever arrangement the Minamoto victory would produce. The night before Dan-no-ura, the Taira fleet rode at anchor in the strait, the same night that has been described before in this channel from Kenreimon-in's perspective, the last night before everything changed. For Tomomori, this night would have carried its own specific weight. He had spent years assessing the trajectory of this war, understanding, more clearly than most, where it was likely heading. The night before, Dan-no-ura was the night before the test of everything he had been assessing, the night before the question of whether the Taira's remaining strength, their naval advantage, their local knowledge of these waters, would be enough to change the pattern that had defined the war since Ichi-no-tani. What Tomomori did on this last night is not recorded in the kind of detail that would let us reconstruct his specific thoughts or actions, but the broader pattern of his role, the man who continued to function, to assess, to contribute, even while understanding the difficulty of the overall situation, suggests that this night was not different in kind from the many nights that had preceded it during the years of retreat. He would have been doing what he had always done, looking at the actual situation, the actual disposition of the fleet, the actual state of morale and capability among the Taira forces, and forming his assessment of what the coming day was likely to bring. The morning would bring Dan-no-ura. Tomomori, perhaps more than anyone else among the Taira leadership, understood what kind of day it was likely to be. The strait, in the hours before dawn, would have been quiet, the way bodies of water are quiet before the activity of the day begins, the specific stillness that precedes events whose outcomes will be irreversible. The Taira fleet, anchored in formation, represented the accumulated strength of a clan that had once controlled Japan, now reduced to this, several hundred ships in a strait at the western edge of the inland sea, carrying an 8-year-old emperor, his mother, the sacred regalia, and the warriors and commanders, including Tomomori, who remained committed to a cause that the clear-sighted among them understood was approaching its final test. The morning was coming. Dan-no-ura was about to begin. The Battle of Dan-no-ura began on the morning of the 24th day of the 3rd month, in the year 1185. The opening hours of the battle favored the Taira, in the way that the chronicles describe with a specific attention to the roll of the tide. The morning current in the strait ran in a direction that worked against the Minamoto ships approaching from the east, while the Taira, positioned with the advantage of the current behind them, found that their archers could maintain effective range against the approaching Minamoto vessels. For Tomomori, these opening hours would have represented something he had not seen much of in the years since Ichi-no-tani. A Taira advantage, materializing as he had hoped it might, the local knowledge of the currents producing exactly the kind of benefit that had been part of the calculation for choosing this location. The accounts describe Taira archers finding their range, the Minamoto ships struggling against a current that favored their opponents, the kind of opening phase that, in a different war, might have been the beginning of a Taira victory. Tomomori, with his characteristic clear-sightedness, would have recognized this advantage for what it was, real, but also temporary, dependent on the tide, which would, inevitably, turn. The question of what happens when a temporary advantage is not converted into a decisive outcome before it disappears is a question that military history is full of examples of, and Tomomori, watching the morning unfold, would have understood that the Taira advantage needed to produce something more than simply holding the Minamoto at range. It needed to translate into actual damage to the Minamoto fleet, actual disruption of their formation and capability, before the tide turned and the advantage reversed. The accounts do not suggest that the morning's Taira advantage produced this kind of decisive damage. The Minamoto ships, under pressure but not destroyed, continued to press forward, continued to maneuver, continued to look for the kind of opening that Yoshitsune's forces had found in every previous engagement of the war. Tomonori's specific actions during these opening hours are not detailed individually in the surviving accounts, in the way that some other Taira commanders' actions at Dan-no-ura are detailed. What can be inferred from the broader pattern of his role and from what comes later in the battle is that Tomonori was engaged in the kind of command function that his position required, coordinating with other Taira commanders, assessing the developing situation, and doing what could be done to convert the morning's advantage into something more lasting. The fleet, as a whole, was fighting the battle that had been planned, the battle that depended on the Taira's knowledge of these waters, and the temporary advantage that knowledge provided. As the morning progressed, the tide began to turn. This is the moment that the chronicles identify as the pivot of the battle, the point at which the advantage that had favored the Taira began to shift toward the Minamoto. The currents that had been working against the Minamoto ships began to work against the Taira ships instead, and the archery advantage that the Taira had held in the opening hours began to diminish as the relative positions of the fleets in relation to the current reversed. Tomonori, watching this shift, would have understood its significance immediately. The temporary advantage that had defined the morning was ending. What came next would depend on whether the Taira had other resources, other advantages, that could sustain their position once the tidal advantage was gone. The afternoon of Dan-no-ura brought the developments that would determine the outcome of the entire war, developments that involved not just the shifting tide, but a more fundamental shift, the kind of shift that Tomonori's clear-sightedness, however acute, could not have prevented, because it did not originate from anything that could be assessed through military analysis alone. It originated from a decision made by someone within the Taira fleet that would change everything. The battle was approaching its decisive phase. Tomonori, who had spent years understanding the trajectory of this war with unusual clarity, was about to witness the moment when that trajectory reached its conclusion. The decision that changed Dan-no-ura, and with it the outcome of the entire Genpei War, was the decision of Taga Chikatoshi, a Taira admiral who, in the course of the afternoon's fighting, switched his allegiance to the Minamoto. This event has been described before in this channel, from kenreimon-in's perspective, the moment that the chronicles mark as the true turning point of the battle, more decisive even than the shifting tide. Taga Chikatoshi knew the disposition of the Taira fleet. He knew which ships carried the emperor, which carried the regalia, which carried the women of the court. This knowledge, transferred to the Minamoto in the middle of the battle, transformed Yoshitsune's targeting from general engagement with the Taira fleet into something far more precise and far more devastating. For Tomonori, this moment would have represented something that even his clear-sightedness had perhaps not specifically anticipated, not because betrayal was unimaginable, but because the specific form it took. The targeting of the emperor's ship and the ships carrying the regalia and the court women converted a difficult battle into something categorically different. The Taira had been fighting throughout the afternoon, a battle that, while difficult, was still a battle between fleets, a contest of military capability where, however unfavorable the odds had become, the outcome remained, in principle, a military question. Tagechikatoshi's defection changed this. The Minamoto archers, now able to target specific ships with specific knowledge of what those ships contained, began to focus their attacks in ways that had nothing to do with general naval engagement and everything to do with reaching the emperor, the regalia, and the people who were with them. What Tomomori did in the hours that followed, as the battle transformed from a military engagement into something closer to a catastrophe unfolding in real time, is one of the most significant aspects of his story, and one that the Heike Monogatari handles with particular attention. The accounts describe Tomomori, in this phase of the battle, moving through the chaos with a specific purpose, not the purpose of continuing to fight the battle as a battle, because by this point the battle, in the conventional sense, was effectively over, but the purpose of bearing witness. He moved among the ships. He observed what was happening to the people who mattered most, the emperor, the regalia, the women of the court, his own family members, as the Minamoto attacks, now precisely targeted, began to produce the outcomes that the defection had made possible. This role, the role of witness, is not a role that military history typically assigns significance to. Battles are remembered for who won and who lost, for the tactical decisions and their consequences, not for who watched and what they saw. But Tomonori's witnessing, in the final hours of Dan-no-ura, became, in the Heike Monogatari's telling, one of the central facts of how this battle is remembered. He saw what happened to Nidono, Kiyomori's widow, the grandmother of the emperor, as she made the decision that would define the battle's most famous moment. He saw what happened to kenreimon-in. He saw what happened to his brothers, to the Taira commanders who had fought alongside him through years of retreat and decline. The clear-sightedness that had defined Tomomori throughout the war, the capacity to see situations as they actually were, rather than as anyone might wish them to be, did not desert him in these final hours. If anything, it became more important than ever, because someone needed to see what was happening, needed to witness it accurately, in order for it to be remembered accurately afterward. Tomomori, in the chaos of Dan-no-ura's final phase, was performing this function, whether or not he understood it in these terms at the time. He was watching the Taira end. He was watching it happen to the people he had spent his entire life among, the family whose rise had shaped his childhood, and whose fall he had, in some sense, seen coming for years. The afternoon was advancing. The battle that had begun with a Taira advantage, that had turned with the tide, and that had been transformed into catastrophe by Tagechikatoshi's defection, was reaching its final stages. Tomomori had witnessed the turn. He had witnessed the targeting of the ships that mattered most. What remained was the witnessing of the endings themselves, the specific moments, ship by ship, person by person, when the Taira world that had existed since before Tomomori was born came to its conclusion. He was about to see all of it. The scene that has been described before in this channel, from kenreimon-in's perspective, the moment when Nidono took the 8-year-old emperor in her arms and stepped into the sea, telling him that there was a pure land beneath the waves, is one of the central images of Dan-no-ura, and one of the central images of the entire Heike Monogatari. From Tomonori's position, witnessing this scene meant something specific. Nidono was his grandmother. The emperor was his nephew. The woman making the decision to take a child into the sea rather than allow him to be captured was a member of his own family, making a choice that Tomomori, in the moments before it happened, could see coming and could not prevent. The accounts describe Nidono's actions with a specific deliberateness: the gathering of the child, the instructions about facing east toward Ise and west toward the Pure Land, the recitation of the Buddha's name, all of it happening in the midst of chaos, but carried out with a clarity of purpose that mirrors, in its own way, the clarity that had defined Tomomori throughout the war. Nidono had made her assessment of the situation. She had concluded that capture, for the Emperor, was not an acceptable outcome, and she had the authority, as the most senior woman of the Taira, to act on that assessment. Tomomori, watching this, would have understood the assessment. He might even have agreed with it, in the sense that his own clear-sightedness about what Dan-no-ura meant for the Taira would have included an understanding of what capture by the Minamoto would mean for the Emperor and for the regalia. Understanding an assessment and watching it be carried out, with a child in the cold water of the strait, are different things. The Heike Monogatari does not give us Tomonori's internal response to this moment in direct terms. What it gives us is the fact of his presence, his witnessing, and the role that this witnessing plays in how the chronicle constructs its account of Dan-no-ura's final hours. Nidono went into the water with the Emperor. The chronicle's description of this moment is one of the most quoted passages in Japanese literature, and Tomomori, among the people present to see it happen, becomes, through his presence in the narrative, one of the channels through which this moment is transmitted to everyone who has read or heard the Heike Monogatari in the 8 centuries since. Kenreimon-in's response to Nidono's action, her own attempt to enter the water, her rescue against her will by a Minamoto warrior who caught her by the hair, has also been described before in this channel. From Tomonori's position, this too was something witnessed. His sister, the mother of the Emperor who had just died in Nidono's arms, attempting to follow him into the sea and being prevented. The accounts describe the chaos of this moment, multiple things happening simultaneously: the Emperor gone, Kenreimon-in's attempt and her rescue, the continuing Minamoto attacks on the targeted ships, and Tomomori, somewhere in the midst of all of this, continuing to witness, continuing to see what was happening to his family in the specific, irreversible detail that only direct witnessing provides. The sacred regalia, during this same period, was undergoing its own crisis. The jewel and the mirror would eventually be recovered, retrieved from the water or from ships that did not sink. The sword, the ancient sword that had been part of the imperial regalia since the age of the gods, went into the sea with the Emperor and was never recovered. Tomomori, witnessing the loss of the sword, would have understood its significance in ways that went beyond the personal. This was not simply a family losing members in a battle. This was the disappearance, into the cold water of Dan-no-ura, of an object that had been part of the foundation of imperial authority in Japan since before written records began. The sword was gone, the Emperor was gone, Tomomori had seen both happen. What remained, as the afternoon continued, was the rest of it: the brothers, the other family members, the warriors who had fought alongside Tomomori through years of retreat, each of them now facing their own version of the choice that Nidono had already made, the choice between capture and the water. Tomomori had witnessed the Emperor. He had witnessed his sister's attempted entry into the sea and her rescue. He was about to witness his brothers. The Heike Monogatari, in its account of Dan-no-ura's final hours, moves through a series of individual fates, the Taira commanders and warriors who, in the moments after Tagachikatoshi's defection made the battle's outcome unmistakable, each faced the question of what came next, and each answered it in their own way. Tomonori's brothers were among these. Munemori, the head of the clan, the eldest surviving son of Kiyomori, did not choose the water. Munemori was captured, taken alive by the Minamoto, and his fate in the aftermath of the battle would be different from the fate of those who chose to die at Dan-no-ura itself. For Tomonori, witnessing Munemori's capture would have meant witnessing the survival, in some form, of the clan's nominal head, even as the clan itself, as a military and political force, ceased to exist in this same afternoon. Other Taira warriors made different choices. The chronicles describe a series of individual deaths, commanders and warriors who, understanding that the battle was lost and that capture was the only alternative to death, chose death, going into the water in various ways, with various preparations, each death its own small scene within the larger catastrophe. Tomonori, witnessing these deaths, one after another, in the chaos of the afternoon, was watching not just individuals, but a pattern, the pattern of an entire warrior class making, in the span of a few hours, the choice that the circumstances had reduced everything to: capture or the water. There was, by this point in the afternoon, very little else available. The specific manner of each death mattered, in the warrior culture that the Taira, despite their courtly refinements, still belonged to. Some warriors went into the water with their armor on, the weight ensuring they would not surface, would not be pulled back the way kenreimon-in had been. Some made specific preparations, weighting themselves deliberately to ensure that the choice, once made, could not be reversed by circumstance or by the intervention of an enemy who might, as had happened with kenreimon-in, prefer a living captive to a dead one. Tomonori, watching these preparations, these final acts of warriors he had known for years, fought alongside through the campaigns of retreat from Kyoto, through Ichinotani, through Yashima, was watching the specific individual versions of an ending that, in the aggregate, represented the end of everything. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from watching, one after another, the deaths of people you have known, in circumstances where each individual death is also part of a larger pattern that you, more than most of the people around you, have understood was coming. Tomonori's clear-sightedness throughout the war had included an understanding that this kind of ending was a real possibility, perhaps even the most likely outcome, given the trajectory the war had followed since Kyoto. Understanding that an ending is possible, even likely, is different from witnessing it happen, person by person, in the specific afternoon when it actually occurs. Tomonori was witnessing it. Each brother, each commander, each warrior who chose the water rather than capture, was someone Tomonori had known, had fought alongside, had perhaps assessed, in his clear-sighted way, as likely to face exactly this choice at exactly this kind of moment. By the later afternoon, the pattern was largely complete. The Emperor was gone, Nidono was gone, the sword was gone. Several of Tomonori's brothers had made their choices, some captured, some choosing the water. Kenreimon-in had been pulled from the water against her will, and was, at this point, a prisoner, though the full implications of this would not become clear until later. Tomonori himself remained, on whatever ship he was on, in the chaos of a battle that was, by every meaningful measure, over. The Taira, as a clan with military and political power, had ceased to exist in the span of this single afternoon. What remained for Tomomori was the question of his own ending, the question that everyone who remained alive on the Taira ships was, in this moment, facing. He had witnessed everyone else's choices. His own was still to come. The choice that Tomomori faced in the final hours of Dan-no-ura was a choice that the warrior culture of 12th century Japan had specific, if not always rigid, expectations about. A warrior, facing inevitable defeat, could be captured. Capture was not, at this point in Japanese history, automatically dishonorable in the absolute sense that it would become in later periods. But capture also meant accepting whatever fate the victors chose to impose, becoming an object of their decisions rather than the author of your own ending. The alternative, choosing death rather than capture, particularly death by one's own action, rather than at the hands of the enemy, carried a specific meaning within this culture, the meaning of remaining, until the very last moment, the author of your own fate. Tomomori's clear-sightedness, the quality that had defined him throughout the war, would have applied to this choice as much as it had applied to every assessment he had made about the war's trajectory. He had watched Munemori choose capture. He had watched other brothers and other warriors choose the water. He had watched Nidono take the emperor into the sea, an act that was not, in the strict sense, Nidono's own death by her own choice in response to her own situation, but something more complicated, a decision made on behalf of a child who could not make it for himself. Tomomori's own situation was simpler, in one sense. He was an adult warrior, a commander, someone who had spent years understanding exactly what kind of war this was, and exactly what kind of ending it was likely to have. The choice in front of him was his own. The Heike Monogatari attributes to Tomomori, at this point, words that have become among the most quoted in the entire chronicle, words that articulate something about the warrior's relationship to death that goes beyond the specific circumstances of Dan-no-ura. The substance of what is attributed to him is this, that he had seen everything worth seeing, that there was nothing left to see, and that a warrior of the Taira should not die at the hands of an enemy. This formulation, seen everything worth seeing, captures something specific about Tomomori's role throughout this final battle, and indeed throughout the war. He had been the witness, the one whose clear-sightedness meant he saw situations as they actually were, including, in these final hours, the situations of everyone around him as they made their own choices about how this day would end for them. Having seen everything, Tomomori's own choice became, in a sense, the final act of his clear-sightedness. He was not going to be captured. He was not going to become an object of Minamoto decisions, a prisoner whose fate would be determined by his enemies, the way Shigehira's fate had been determined after Ichinotani, the way Munemori's fate would now be determined. He was going to die by his own choice, in his own way, completing the pattern of seeing situations clearly and acting on that clarity that had defined his role throughout the war. But the manner of this final choice, the specific way Tomomori chose to ensure that his death would be his own, and not something that could be interrupted or reversed, the way Kenreimon-in's attempted death had been interrupted, was itself something that required preparation, something that Tomomori, with his characteristic thoroughness, was about to undertake. Kenreimon-in had gone into the water and been pulled back. The chronicle does not let this fact disappear from the narrative, even as it moves toward Tomonori's own ending. A warrior choosing the water faced the same risk, the risk that armor alone might not be sufficient, that the body might float, might be recovered, might become, against the warrior's own intention, a captive after all, alive when the intention had been to die. Tomonori, understanding this risk with the same clarity he had applied to every other assessment of the war, was not going to leave his own ending to chance. He was going to ensure, through deliberate preparation, that what he had decided would actually happen, that there would be no possibility of the kind of interruption that had prevented kenreimon-in from completing her own intended death. What Tomonori needed for this preparation was something that would ensure that once he entered the water, he would not come back up. Something heavy, something that, attached to his body, would take him down and keep him down, regardless of the buoyancy of armor or robes, regardless of any current or any Minamoto warrior with a pole who might, as had happened with kenreimon-in, attempt to pull him back. The afternoon was ending. Dan-no-ura was, in every meaningful sense, over. Tomonori had made his choice. What remained was the specific, practical matter of carrying it out in a way that would ensure it could not be undone. The image of Tomonori with the anchor is one of the most enduring images in the entire Heike monogatari, an image that has been depicted in art, referenced in later literature, and remembered across 8 centuries as one of the defining moments of Dan-no-ura. An anchor, on a 12th century Japanese warship, was a substantial object, made of iron or stone, heavy enough to hold a ship in place against current and tide, exactly the kind of object that, attached to a person, would ensure that person did not float, did not surface, did not become available for rescue or recovery. Tomonori took 2 anchors. The chronicle's description of what Tomonori did in these final moments is specific in a way that conveys both the practical thoroughness of the preparation and the deliberate, almost ceremonial quality of the act. He placed one anchor under one arm and the second anchor under the other arm, securing them against his body in a way that would ensure that when he entered the water, the weight would take him down immediately and keep him there. This was not a hasty or improvised action. It was the kind of careful preparation that Tomonori had applied to every assessment throughout the war, now applied to the final assessment, the assessment of how to ensure that his own death would be exactly what he intended it to be, with no possibility of the kind of interruption that had affected kenreimon-in. There is something in this image, the commander known throughout the war for his clear-sighted assessment of situations, applying that same clear-sightedness to the practical mechanics of his own death, that captures something essential about who Tomonori had been. He had spent years seeing situations as they actually were, not as anyone wished them to be. In this final moment, he was doing the same thing, seeing the situation of his own death as it actually needed to be constructed, if it was going to be the death he had chosen, rather than a death that circumstance might alter. The anchors were not a symbol, in the sense of being primarily about meaning rather than function. They were functional, practical, exactly suited to the purpose Tomonori needed them for, but their functionality, in the context of everything that had led to this moment, also carried meaning, the meaning of a man ensuring, through careful preparation, that his death would be entirely his own. The accounts describe Tomonori in these final moments, looking around at the scene of Dan-no-ura, the ships, the water, the chaos that was, by this point in the afternoon, beginning to settle into the specific stillness that follows the end of a battle, when the fighting has stopped because there is, in a fundamental sense, nothing left to fight over. The emperor was gone, the sword was gone, Nidono was gone, most of his brothers had made their choices, captured or drowned. Kenreimon-in had been pulled from the water, alive but a prisoner. Tomomori, with the anchors secured under his arms, was looking at all of this, the complete picture of Dan-no-ura's outcome, the complete picture of what had happened to the Taira in this single afternoon. This is the moment that the chronicle's attribution of words to Tomomori, the statement about having seen everything worth seeing, refers to. He had seen it all: the morning's advantage, the turning tide, the defection, the targeted attacks, the emperor's death, his sister's rescue, his brother's choices. There was, in the most literal sense, nothing left for Tomomori to witness that he had not already witnessed. The role of witness that Tomomori had been performing throughout the afternoon, whether by deliberate choice or simply because his position and his nature made him someone who saw clearly what was happening around him, was complete. The witnessing was done. What remained was the final act, the one that Tomomori himself would now perform, the one that the anchors had been prepared for. The strait of Dan-no-ura, in the late afternoon of the 24th day of the 3rd month, 1185, held within it the accumulated outcomes of an entire war's final battle. An emperor, a sword, a grandmother, brothers, warriors, ships, the regalia, all of it now part of the strait's history in ways that would be remembered for centuries. Tomomori, with the anchors secured, was standing at the edge of his ship, looking at the water that had already received so much of what the Taira had been. He was about to add himself to it, not as a witness this time, as the final thing being witnessed by whoever remained to see it, the last act of the man who had seen everything, completing his own role in the story he had spent the entire war understanding more clearly than almost anyone else. The moment of Tomomori's death, as the Heike Monogatari describes it, is brief, in the way that the most significant moments in the chronicle are often brief, the narrative slowing down to give weight to the preparation, and then moving quickly through the act itself, as though the act, once the preparation is complete, requires no further elaboration. He stepped off the ship. The 2 anchors, secured under his arms, did exactly what they had been chosen to do. The weight took him down immediately, faster than armor alone would have, faster than the natural buoyancy of a human body in water could counteract. There was no struggle, in the way that Kenreimon-in's entry into the water had involved struggle, both her own attempt to go under and her subsequent struggle against the Minamoto warrior who pulled her back. Tomomori went down and did not come back up. The water of Dan-no-ura in the 3rd month would have been cold, the same cold water that had received the emperor, that had received Nidono, that had received the sword. Tomomori, sinking with the weight of the anchors, joined all of this, became part of the strait's accumulated history in the most literal sense, his body settling toward the seafloor in the same waters where so much else that had defined the Taira had already gone. The chronicle does not follow him down, in the sense of describing what happened to his body after this moment. The narrative attention, having followed Tomomori through his preparation and his final act, moves on to the broader accounting of Dan-no-ura's outcome, to the captures, to the survivors, to what would happen next. Tomomori's death is recorded, and then the chronicle continues. There is something in this narrative choice, the brevity with which Tomonori's actual death is described after the careful attention given to his preparation, that mirrors the quality of clear-sightedness that had defined him throughout his life. The preparation mattered. The preparation was where Tomonori's characteristic thoroughness, his refusal to leave anything to chance, his determination that this final act would be entirely his own, was expressed. The act itself, once the preparation was complete, was simply the execution of a decision that had already been made, the final demonstration of clear-sightedness applied to its own conclusion. Tomonori had seen everything. He had prepared accordingly. The jump itself was almost an afterthought, the inevitable consequence of everything that had come before it. For the people who remained, on the ships and in the water, in the aftermath of Dan-no-ura, Tomonori's death would have been one among many, another commander who had chosen the water rather than capture, another body added to the strait. But the specific manner of his death, the anchors, the deliberate ensuring that there would be no possibility of rescue or recovery, distinguished it, even in the midst of so many other deaths and captures happening in the same hours. Tomonori had not simply died, he had ensured his death, with the same clarity that had characterized everything else he had done throughout the war. This distinction between dying and ensuring one's death, between an outcome that happens to you and an outcome that you author, completely, down to the smallest practical detail, is part of what makes Tomonori's ending resonate, in the way it has resonated for 8 centuries. Kenreimon-in, on a different ship, pulled from the water against her will, would not have witnessed Tomonori's death directly, in the chaos of the afternoon's final hours. But she would learn of it, eventually, as she would learn of all of the deaths of Dan-no-ura, in the aftermath, in the accounting that survivors and captives inevitably undertake, the piecing together of who was lost and how. Tomonori, her brother, the commander known for seeing things clearly, had seen Dan-no-ura clearly, to its very end, and had ensured that his own ending was as clear and as final as everything else he had assessed throughout the war. The afternoon was ending. Dan-no-ura was over. Tomonori was in the water, with the anchors, at the bottom of the strait, where he would remain. The Strait of Dan-no-ura, in the days and years after the battle, became a place that held a specific kind of significance, the site where an entire era of Japanese history had ended in the span of a single afternoon. The sword, the ancient sword of the imperial regalia, remained somewhere in these waters, never recovered, a permanent absence at the heart of the imperial regalia that would persist for the rest of Japanese history. The emperor's body, and Nidono's, and Tomonori's, and the bodies of the many others who had gone into the water during Dan-no-ura's final hours, became part of the strait in ways that the people who lived in the region, in the centuries that followed, would remember and mark in various ways. There is a tradition in the region around Dan-no-ura connected to a species of crab found in these waters, crabs whose shell pattern resembles, to those who look for it, the face of a warrior, an angry or grieving expression formed by the natural markings of the shell. These crabs are called Heike crabs, and the tradition holds that they are the spirits of the Taira warriors who died at Dan-no-ura, transformed, remaining in the waters where they fell, their warrior faces preserved in the shells of creatures that still live in these waters today. Whether Tomonori is, in this tradition, among the warriors whose spirits the crabs represent, is not something any specific account establishes, but the broader tradition, the sense that Dan-no-ura's waters hold something of everyone who died there, that the strait itself became, in the popular imagination, a kind of permanent memorial, a place where the past remains present in the physical reality of the location, is part of how Tomonori's death, and the deaths of everyone else at Dan-no-ura, have been remembered. Tomonori's body was not recovered, as far as the records indicate. The anchors had done what they were intended to do, and the man who had spent the war seeing things clearly had ensured that his death would be equally clear, equally final, equally beyond the possibility of reversal or rescue. This is different from Shigehira, whose body, after his execution at the Kizugawa, would have been disposed of according to whatever practices govern such things, in a location on land, with at least the possibility of some form of memorial or marking. Tomonori remained in the water, at Dan-no-ura, in the strait whose currents he had understood, whose tactical significance he had assessed, and that had, in the end, become not a tactical asset, but his final resting place. The Heike Monogatari's treatment of Tomonori across the entire chronicle follows a pattern that distinguishes him from many of the other figures whose stories the chronicle tells. He is not a figure of dramatic reversal, like Shigehira, whose story moves from villain to a more complex figure recognized for cultivation even in captivity. He is not a figure of survival into a long aftermath, like Kenreimon-in, whose story continues for decades after Dan-no-ura, in prayer and reflection. Tomonori is a figure of consistency. The clear-sightedness that defines him at the beginning of his appearances in the chronicle is the same clear-sightedness that defines his final act. He saw clearly throughout, and his death was the final expression of that clarity applied to its own most personal and most final question. The waters of Dan-no-ura today are part of the Strait of Kanmon, between Honshu and Kyushu, one of the busiest shipping channels in Japan, ships passing daily through the same waters where, 8 centuries ago, an entire era ended in a single afternoon. The currents that Tomonori and the other Taira commanders understood, that they had hoped would provide an advantage at Dan-no-ura, are still there. The tidal flows that make this strait, even today, a place that requires careful navigation. Tomonori is still there too, in the sense that the strait itself, and the stories told about it, and the crabs with the warrior faces, and the sword that was never recovered, all of it constitutes a kind of permanent presence, the physical location where Tomonori's clear-sightedness reached its final, irreversible conclusion. The sea holds what it holds. Tomonori chose to become part of what the sea holds, deliberately, with the same clarity that had defined everything else about him. The Heike Monogatari ends in its final chapter with Kenreimon-in in the mountain valley of Ohara, praying for the dead, having survived Dan-no-ura against her own intention, having lived through what she described to Go-Shirakawa as all 6 realms of Buddhist existence in a single lifetime. Tomonori's story, within this larger structure, occupies a different position. He did not survive into an aftermath. He did not have the opportunity or the burden, depending on how one views it, of decades of reflection, of prayer, of the slow processing of loss that defined Kenreimon-in's remaining years. His story ends at Dan-no-ura, in the water, with the anchors, in the afternoon of the 24th day of the 3rd month, 1185. And yet, in its own way, Tomonori's story carries forward into how Dan-no-ura itself is remembered, into the specific images that have defined this battle for 8 centuries. The Emperor in Nidono's arms facing the Pure Land, Kenreimon-in pulled from the water against her will, the sword lost forever, and Tomomori with the anchors, having seen everything worth seeing, choosing the manner of his own ending with the same clarity that had defined his entire role in the war. These images, together, constitute Dan-no-ura, the way the battle is remembered, the way its meaning has been transmitted across the centuries. Tomonori's image, the anchors, the deliberate preparation, the clear-sighted assessment applied to its own final question, is one of the central images in this constellation. There is a way of understanding Tomonori's role in the Heike monogatari that connects him to the larger themes the chronicle is built around: the impermanence of all things, the inevitability of the fall that follows every rise, the specific Buddhist understanding that underlies the chronicle's famous opening lines about the bell of Gion Shoja and the flowers of Sarasoju. Tomonori, more than perhaps any other figure in the chronicle, embodied an awareness of this impermanence throughout the events the chronicle describes, not as a philosophical position, but as a practical, ongoing assessment of an actual situation. He saw the Taira's rise as something that had already, in its own way, contained the seeds of its eventual fall. He saw each subsequent defeat as part of a pattern that was moving toward a specific kind of conclusion, and when that conclusion arrived, at Dan-no-ura, he was prepared for it, in the most literal sense, with the anchors, with the clear-sighted determination that his own ending would be exactly what he intended. What does it mean to see clearly throughout a war that you understand, more clearly than the people around you, is heading toward catastrophe? Tomonori's story does not offer an answer to this question in the sense of a resolution, a way that clear-sightedness changes the outcome or provides comfort in the face of it. The Taira fell, regardless of what Tomonori saw or understood. Nidono and the Emperor and the sword went into the sea, regardless of any warning Tomonori might have given about the patterns that led to Dan-no-ura. What Tomonori's clear-sightedness provided in the end was not a different outcome, but a different relationship to the outcome that occurred. He was not surprised by Dan-no-ura. He had been expecting something like this, in the broad strokes, if not the specific details, for years, and when it arrived, he was ready, with the anchors, with the determination that his own part in this ending would be entirely his own. The strait of Dan-no-ura holds the sword, and the Emperor and Nidono and Tomonori and so many others, the accumulated weight of an entire era's ending, concentrated into a single afternoon, in a single stretch of water, between 2 islands. Tomonori saw it happen. He saw all of it, from the morning's temporary advantage to the turning tide, to the defection, to the targeted attacks, to the Emperor's death, to his sister's rescue, to his brother's choices. He had seen everything worth seeing, and then, with the anchors secured, he added his own ending to everything else the strait now held, the final act of a man whose defining quality, throughout the war and at its conclusion, was the refusal to look away from what was actually happening, and the determination, when his own moment came, to meet it with the same clarity he had brought to everything else. The sea received him, the sea still holds him. He is still there, in the strait, in the currents, in the story that has been told for 8 centuries, the man who saw it all end, and who ended himself exactly as he had decided he would.